careful, please. That elite was an ultra.
If you've read books like Rough Stone Rolling, or are familiar with the historical record, you may have seen claims that the early saints spoke in tongues, or they were speaking in tongues. If you get on YouTube and you look up speaking in tongues, you'll find no shortage of these videos of what I would call a downright satanic and unnatural practice called glossolalia, in which these evangelical Protestants will have convulsions and seizures and shaking and movings and utter these guttural noises that don't sound much like language at all, and they sound more like a seizure or someone with palsy attempting to speak. Downright disturbing stuff. And so, when we read this stuff like Rough Stone Rolling and we hear that the early saints practiced something as bizarre as glossolalia or speaking in tongues, this can be very concerning to us as modern members of the church. For one, we no longer practice this, and for two, it's weird. So how can we reconcile this? Does this undermine our position as saints? Is there such a thing as speaking in tongues? And is there a false gift of speaking in tongues? So that's what we're going to talk about. Obviously, speaking in tongues is a real gift, if the Bible is true, because we are told that the apostles spoke in tongues at Pentecost, right? And also, there's many descriptions of how when the apostles spoke, every man understood the language in his own tongue. And this is one of the key parts of the true gift of tongues, is that in order for it to be the real gift of tongues, there needs to be interpretation. There needs to be meaning. Otherwise, it's just satanic technobabble. And it may surprise you to know that we used to speak in tongues, at least symbolically, in the temple, as part of the endowment ceremony. One thing that's been comforting to me is that Joseph Smith drew this distinction and said that, many of these other groups, other religious groups who practice glossolalia are acted upon by a spirit, but it's not the Spirit of God, because God cannot be the author of chaos. And certainly some of this strange babblings is chaotic. It feels evil to me, and I think it feels evil to anyone with sense. But Joseph Smith did teach about the idea of an Adamic language, an original, pure language. He said that much of English, and especially German, preserves a lot of this original Adamic language, which is pretty curious. We know from modern linguistics that both English and German descend from the same language, which we would call like Proto-Indo-European. It's interesting that Joseph Smith would single out English and German specifically rather than something like Hebrew, which is a Semitic language, as they have different roots, different linguistic roots. That's what Joseph Smith had to say. He considered the German translation of the scriptures more correct than any other, and furthermore, he believed the German people were more honest than many other nations. What about this stuff about Adamic or speaking in tongues in the temple? Let's talk about that. So before we talk about that, we need to dip back into Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages. Maybe I overuse this book, but he is English, he is a Freemason. The cultural roots of Mormonism are English and Freemasonic, so I like to read from it. I think it helps. You're familiar with Alma, this scripture I reference frequently, about all things testify of their Creator, everything testifies that God exists. And historically, this is a pretty common belief historically. Many people believed man and his body were basically baked into the cake of creation, and by studying the body of man, you would understand more about the universe, and by studying the universe, you'd understand more about man, and so, the solar system, different stars and stuff corresponded to different organs of the body. The study of anatomy and the study of astrology were very much related, which we've mentioned that when we talk about, Hippocrates. When we talk about the temple, obviously the most important scripture in the New Testament is the Transfiguration of Jesus, and Manly P. Hall has something to say about that, so let's read it really quick. He says, "The pagan priests always considered the solar system as a grand man, and drew their analogy of these three centers of activity from the three main centers of life in the human body: the brain, the heart, and the generative system." The transfiguration of Jesus describes 3 tabernacles, the largest being in the center, the heart, and a smaller one on either side, the brain and the generative system, which is a euphemism for you-know-what. And so we see that when it comes to the idea of the tabernacles that are on the Mountain of Transfiguration, he associates them with the heart, the mind, and the you-know-what, the generative, procreative system. He suggests that, the different chambers within the pyramids are symbolic of the same things, and I believe for this reason, if you go to southern Utah, there's actually a pyramid-shaped temple that was built by some fundamentalists. I believe it's the Peterson group, or it is the Peterson group. It's not, I believe. And they believe a lot in this idea of sacred geometry, pyramid power, as I've heard it mocked a little bit. It was all in good fun, they kind of teased the idea that they like sacred geometry, they like pyramid power, and apparently they used to pray holding their fingers in a sort of pyramidic shape. You put your 2 middle fingers together, your 2 thumbs together, and then you point your index fingers straight up from that, kind of creating a little pyramid. And so, pyramid power, it can help channel your chakras or something. But there is some validity to the idea of sacred geometry, so as silly as that all sounds, as Dungeons and Dragons as that all sounds, there is some validity to the idea of sacred geometry. And so for that reason, they built their temple in the shape of a pyramid, which looks very 70s, it's very 70s. You can't bully it too much because everyone hates our temples that were built in the 70s too. The whole cloud, pillar of fire thing. So, the body is represented in the temple. It is represented in the tabernacle. I guess the idea is that, the Holy of Holies would be like the brain, the holy place would be like the torso, and so I'm not exactly sure what in the holy place would correspond to the heart, if it's the shewbread or the menorah. And outside, in the courtyard, I assume Manly P. Hall would say something corresponds to the generative system. That's not that important to what we are talking about, but what is important is that what is between the heart and the head, the neck, right? And if we go to the temple, what is between the holy place and the Holy of Holies? It's the altar. And in the temple we learn about how Adam gave a prayer, and we learn the true order of prayer at the altar before we are to go into the Holy of Holies. And so Manly P. Hall says this about the altar in the ancient Hebrew tabernacle. He says, "This altar was symbolic of the human larynx, which the words of man's mouth ascend as an acceptable offering unto God. For the larynx occupies the position in the constitution of man between the holy place, which is the trunk of his body, and the Holy of Holies, which is the head with its contents." This really stuck out to me because what we learn about what Adam said in his prayer, he cried out to the Lord that the Lord would hear his voice. And the altar corresponds to the larynx, is what Manly P. Hall says. What we say in the temple has been translated, and we used to say the words, whether it's in the Adamic language or if it's merely symbolic of the Adamic language, I'm not sure, but we used to utter 3 syllables that are basically the words mouth to God in Hebrew, something close to Hebrew. So mouth to God, mouth to God, mouth to God. This is the prayer that Adam gave. I think that there's a lot of cool stuff when we talk about the Adamic language, the original language of the ancients. Certainly it was much better at conveying information. Language is an imperfect thing. But language is ultimately a tool from God to communicate with Him and to record His teachings for the next generations. And Hugh Nibley used to talk about how most of the origin myths of language, where did we learn this language? It came from angelic beings who gave us this language so that we could record our genealogy, record our history, and record the teachings of divine beings. So I don't think that you need to go about trying to figure out how to speak in tongues or how to understand the Adamic language, but linguistically it seems related to German, and I think it's cool. I think we should bring it back, this idea of speaking in tongues in the temple, And I think that offering this prayer at the larynx of the temple is really cool. So let's just finish this out with reading another quote from Manly P. Hall. He says, "The 3 degrees of the ancient mysteries were, with few exceptions, given in chambers which represented the 3 great centers of the human and universal bodies. If possible, the temple itself was constructed in the form of the human body. The candidate entered between the feet and received the highest degree in the point corresponding to the brain. Thus, the first degree was the material mysteries, and its symbol was the generative system. It raised the candidate through the various degrees of concrete thought. The second degree was given in the chamber corresponding to the heart, but represented the middle power, which was the mental link. Here the candidate was initiated into the mysteries of abstract thought and lifted as high as the mind was capable of penetrating. He then passed into the third chamber, which, analogous to the brain, occupied the highest position in the temple, but, analogous to the heart, was of the greatest dignity. In the brain chamber, the heart mystery was given. Here the initiate, for the first time, truly comprehended the meaning of those immortal words, 'As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he.' As there are 7 hearts in the brain, so there are 7 brains in the heart. But this is a matter of superphysics of which little can be said at the present time." So, there's some stuff to think about next time you go to the temple. Are the various chambers in the temple symbolic of the human body? At the lowest point of the temple, we have the baptismal font, and at the highest part of the temple, we have the celestial room. The baptismal chamber is where we do baptisms, and is that symbolic of the washing of the feet? We give a prayer at the neck of the body. We speak in tongues at the neck of the body. So things to think about. I think it's really cool. The gift of tongues is real, but there are many counterfeits to be aware of. I'm a little hesitant to believe that Joseph Smith was actively encouraging people to engage in glossolalia, though certainly some of the saints brought these traditions from their churches. I think that Joseph Smith did try to persuade people against this. I've seen several quotes that seem to suggest this, so I don't really believe Brigham and Joseph were really into this techno-babble stuff, in as much as that they were super interested in language and the origin of language and the idea of a pure Adamic language that can convey information perfectly. Those are my thoughts about how to speak Adamic and how to recognize the true gift of tongues. That's all for today. Hope this was interesting, and have a good one.